During Hitler's time as the dictator of Germany, there were many acts of resistance against his Nazi regime. Hitler himself faced many assassination attempts, but to oppose the regime instilled was very dangerous. Sophie Scholl, for example, was part of the White Rose movement, and she was involved in distributing anti-Nazi propaganda. For this she was sentenced to death alongside her brother when caught, and was guillotined. There were many other acts of resistance and resistance groups that emerged within Germany, but today we look at one small element of the Edelweiss Pirates. As expected, to defy Hitler was usually met with brutal reprisals, and the Cologne section of the movement was dealt with incredibly brutally. Today we look at the brutal executions of the Edelweiss Pirates of Cologne, and remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Edelweiss Pirates were an element of German youth culture that did not conform to the ideals of the Nazis. They emerged before the Second World War as a reaction to the Hitler Youth being used to indoctrinate and brainwash young people. They saw the youth groups for boys and girls as dangerous, and the Edelweiss Pirates offered youngsters freedom to express themselves and mix with the opposite sex. This was different to the Nazi youth groups, which were segregated by gender. The first group was made up of mostly teenagers between 14 and 18, and different elements grew up in different parts of Germany. There were many subgroups, for example the Navajos in Cologne or the Kittelback Pirates of Dusseldorf. The group were feared by local Nazi governments, as they also sought to beat up Hitler Youth patrols, and they got involved in acts of provocation. The Edelweiss Pirates also distributed anti-Nazi propaganda, and would meet to take part in hiking and camping trips. As mentioned, their enemies really were the Hitler Youth, and they took great pride in starting fights with them. The Nazis before the war saw them as irritating, as they didn't abide by the terror established by the police state. But as the conflict continued, their activities became more extreme, and after this, punishments got more severe. The Gestapo began to keep track on different sections of the group, and some were sent to concentration camps, held in prisons, and even forced to have their heads shaved. In October 1944, Heinrich Himmler, who had had enough of their activities, announced a crackdown on the Edelweiss Pirates. The Ehrenfeld or Steinbrück Group were a youth group of around 100 inside of the Ehrenfeld district of Cologne. Many were Edelweiss Pirates. They took their name from Hans Steinbrück, an escapee from a concentration camp who came to the district. He began to build up weapons and foodstuffs in the cellar of a house, and he then fenced stolen goods. He even gave shelter in his cellar for Jews and those who were being hunted by the Gestapo. In the summer of 1944, a number of Edelweiss pirates began to speak with Steinbrück. He was only 23 himself, and together they formed a resistance group. Over time, the group gained notoriety, stealing food and also cars and vehicles, and contributing to the black market inside of Cologne. The group grew in their numbers, as did their ambitions. They carried out a heist, stealing butter, and sold it afterwards on the black market for 12,000 Reichsmarks, which was a colossal sum of money. The average wage at the time was just 50 Reichsmarks a week, but they repeated the heist and then got 123,000 marks for it on the black market. But at some point the army were informed about the cellar storehouse, and it was searched, with weapons being confiscated. Steinbrück managed to escape, but then the authorities began to round up members of the Edelweiss Pirates and the group. Steinbrück, together with another man, decided to hunt Nazis, and they took a number of members of the group with them. They opened fire, injuring a guard, and also later killed a member of the SA and also a civilian. They then also, whilst waiting by train tracks, killed a member of the Hitler Youth. They then tried to steal some explosives, however this was foiled, and the Gestapo on the 8th of October 1944 began to round up members of the group. They made 63 arrests, and of these 19 were teenagers. Because of their resistance, 13 German males were condemned to die, and were executed without trial in a mass-scale public hanging in front of a huge crowd in Cologne, next to the Ehrenfeld train station. The plan of the group had been to blow up the Gestapo headquarters in Cologne, and those imprisoned had been tortured for weeks on end. On the 10th of November 1944, a public gallows had been created on a public road near to the train station. This was made rather large to carry out the mass execution. In front of a huge crowd, 13 men were led out to the gallows and were stood under them. Of those who were executed that day, there were 6 teenagers, with the youngest being Barthel Schenk, Gunther Schwartz and Johann Müller, who were just 16 years old. The 13 boys and men were then stood under the gallows, and they were stood on a wooden beam initially. They were then placed upon a stool, and then the noose was placed around their neck after it was passed over the top of the gallows. The Nazi guards then stood back, and simultaneously the stools were kicked out from below the condemned, and they were slowly then left strangling to death. The executions of the group was not instant, and it was a rather slow process, with them struggling whilst a huge crowd looked on. All 13 struggled and took minutes to die, taking their last gasps. Amongst the dead was Steinbrück, but the Nazis got what they wanted from the huge spectacle of the execution. Today a plaque in Ehrenfeld marks the site of the execution and is dedicated to the memory of those 13 who suffered the wrath of the Gestapo and the Nazis. Over the decades, the reputation of the Edelweiss Pirates has been rehabilitated, and today they're seen as an important part of resistance against Hitler and the Nazis. Interestingly, Schinkstrasse marks the site where the executions took place, a memorial to one of the young men who was part of the over a dozen who were executed that day. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.